There are defining moments in life that arrive without warning, dressed in the ordinary clothes of a Tuesday afternoon, carrying the weight of a question so simple it shatters every wall we've built around our hearts. For Daniel Harrington, that moment came when he walked into his favorite bakery at closing time and heard a small voice ask a question that would haunt him, heal him, and ultimately transform everything he thought he knew about success, fatherhood, and the true meaning of wealth. Daniel was 38 years old and looked every inch the conquering hero of the corporate world. His suits were tailored in Milan, his watch cost more than most people's cars, and his tech company had just been valued at over $2 billion. He was the kind of man business magazines profiled, the kind of success story that made investors salivate and competitors nervous. But beneath the perfectly pressed shirts and the confident stride was a man running from ghosts, working 18-hour days to avoid the empty penthouse where his son's bedroom sat untouched, where his ex-wife's absence echoed through rooms that had everything money could buy except the presence of love. His son, Marcus, was 7 years old and lived with Daniel's ex-wife in another state, seeing his father only during court-mandated visits that felt more like business meetings than family time. Daniel told himself he was building an empire for his son's future, that the sacrifices were necessary, that love could be measured in trust funds and inheritance. He had convinced himself so thoroughly of this lie that he almost believed it, right up until the moment a child's voice cracked through his carefully constructed delusions like a stone through glass. It was 6:30 in the evening, and Daniel had just left another marathon board meeting. His head pounded with stress, and his stomach reminded him he'd forgotten to eat lunch again. He ducked into Sweet Haven Bakery, a small family-owned shop wedged between towering office buildings, the kind of place that survived on charm and quality in a neighborhood dominated by corporate chains. He'd been coming here for 3 years, always ordering the same thing, barely noticing the warm smile of the elderly owner or the smell of fresh bread that filled the small space like a grandmother's embrace. As he pushed through the door, the little bell chiming above him, he noticed the shop was nearly empty. The display cases that had been full that morning now showed mostly bare shelves, just a few items remaining at day's end. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was behind the counter, and she was speaking softly to someone Daniel couldn't see. He approached, already reaching for his wallet, when a small head popped up from behind the counter. A boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with enormous brown eyes and clothes that had been washed so many times the colors had faded to ghosts of what they'd once been. The boy looked at Mrs. Chen with an expression of such desperate hope mixed with crushing embarrassment that Daniel felt something twist in his chest. And then the boy spoke, his voice small but clear, each word falling into the quiet shop like a stone into still water. He said that his mommy hadn't eaten in 2 days, that she'd given him her portions and told him she wasn't hungry, but he knew she was lying. He said he'd found some coins in the couch cushions, and he asked, with a politeness that seemed taught through love rather than mere manners, if Mrs. Chen might share some of the expired bread, the kind she usually threw away at closing time. He promised his mother wouldn't mind that it was expired. He promised they would be so grateful. He promised he would pay her back someday when he was big. The silence that followed was the kind that changes people. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears, and her hand went to her heart as if it might stop beating from the weight of what she'd just heard. Daniel stood frozen 3 feet away, his expensive leather wallet suddenly feeling obscene in his hand, his thoughts grinding to a halt as his mind tried to process what he'd just witnessed. This boy, this small child who should have been thinking about cartoons and playground games, was begging for expired bread to feed his starving mother, and he was doing it with dignity and grace that most adults never manage to find. Mrs. Chen moved first, coming around the counter and kneeling in front of the boy. She told him to put his coins away, that she had fresh bread for him, not expired, and that she wanted to send food home for both him and his mother. She began pulling items from the case, her hands shaking, packing them into a bag with care while tears ran down her weathered cheeks. The boy tried to protest, tried to insist he could only take the expired items, that his mother had taught him never to accept charity, but Mrs. Chen shushed him gently and kept packing. Daniel watched this unfold as if from a great distance, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life in someone else's world. But then the boy turned, perhaps feeling Daniel's stare, and their eyes met. In that instant, Daniel saw his own son Marcus looking back at him, and the weight of every missed dinner, every forgotten bedtime story, every phone call cut short by another urgent meeting came crashing down on him with the force of a building collapse. He saw himself as he truly was, a man who had everything except what mattered, standing in a bakery at closing time while a child begged for expired bread to feed his mother. He stepped forward, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He asked the boy his name. The child hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Chen as if asking permission to speak to strangers, then replied that his name was Christopher, but his mom called him Chris. Daniel knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, something he couldn't remember doing with his own son in months. He asked Chris where he lived, if his mother was okay, if there was someone who could help them. The boy's face closed off slightly, that protective instinct that poverty teaches early, but he answered that his mom was sick, that she'd lost her job, that they were staying with a friend but might have to leave soon. Daniel felt something crack inside him, some wall he'd spent years building brick by brick from ambition and fear and the desire to never be vulnerable again. He told Chris that he wanted to help, that he'd like to make sure both he and his mother had food, not just for today but for many days. The boy's eyes went wide, and suspicion mixed with hope in his expression, that terrible calculation that children shouldn't have to make about whether adults can be trusted. He asked why Daniel would do that, what he wanted in return, and the question landed like a punch because it revealed a child who'd already learned that kindness usually came with a price tag. Daniel had no good answer except the truth. He told Chris that he had a son about his age, a son he didn't see enough, a son he'd failed in ways that were different but no less real than what Chris was experiencing. He said that maybe helping Chris and his mother was a way of remembering that people mattered more than profits, that being a father meant more than providing money, that he'd forgotten these things and needed to remember them before it was too late. The boy studied him with those ancient eyes children of hardship develop, then slowly nodded as if granting permission for Daniel to redeem a small piece of his soul. What happened next unfolded with the strange inevitability of fate correcting itself. Daniel asked if he could meet Chris's mother, if he could speak with her about ways to help that would respect her dignity. Chris was hesitant but eventually agreed, and Mrs. Chen offered to close the shop and come along, her protective instincts for the boy obvious in every gesture. They walked 3 blocks to a rundown apartment building, climbed 4 flights of stairs, and knocked on a door that had been patched with duct tape. The woman who answered was perhaps 30 years old but looked older, worn down by stress and illness and the grinding cruelty of poverty that never lets you rest. Her name was Sarah, and when she saw her son holding bags of food with 2 strangers standing behind him, her face cycled through emotions so quickly Daniel couldn't track them all. Fear, confusion, gratitude, shame, defiance, exhaustion. She tried to thank Mrs. Chen, tried to explain that Chris shouldn't have bothered anyone, tried to maintain dignity in circumstances that had stripped away almost everything else. Daniel introduced himself, just his first name, leaving off the titles and company names that usually preceded him like trumpets announcing royalty. He explained what had happened in the bakery, what Chris had asked for, and he watched Sarah's face crumble as she realized her son had been begging for expired bread. She pulled Chris close, and Daniel could see her trembling, could see the war she was fighting to hold herself together in front of strangers. He spoke quietly, carefully, explaining that he wanted to help but understood that pride mattered, that dignity wasn't a luxury but a necessity. He asked if she would allow him to do something, not as charity but as one parent to another, as someone who was learning too late what really mattered in life. Over the next hour, sitting in that cramped apartment with furniture that had seen better decades, Daniel heard Sarah's story. She'd been a nurse before getting sick, before the medical bills piled up faster than insurance would cover them, before she lost her job and then her apartment and then everything else in the domino fall that happens when the safety net turns out to be full of holes. She'd been trying to shield Chris from the worst of it, going hungry so he could eat, telling him stories at night so he wouldn't hear her crying in the bathroom. She'd been days away from losing even this temporary room, from having to take Chris to a shelter or worse, and the shame of that possibility was eating her alive from the inside. Daniel listened without interrupting, without offering easy solutions or meaningless platitudes. He thought about his own ex-wife, about the arguments over his work schedule, about how he'd told her the long hours were temporary, that success required sacrifice, that they'd have time for family once he'd built the empire. He thought about Marcus, about how his son's voice had started to sound hesitant on their weekly phone calls, about how the last time they'd visited, Marcus had asked his mother if Daddy didn't like them anymore. He thought about all the ways success had felt like winning while he was losing everything that actually mattered. When Sarah finished talking, when the story had emptied out of her like poison from a wound, Daniel told her what he wanted to do. He wanted to pay 3 months' rent up front, give her time to recover and find work without the terror of homelessness hanging over her. He wanted to make sure there was always food in the house, that Chris never had to ask strangers for expired bread again. He wanted to help her find medical care for whatever illness was keeping her down, to use his connections and resources to cut through the red tape that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty. And in return, he asked only that she let him bring Marcus to visit sometimes, to let his son see what real courage looked like, to help him understand that success measured in dollars meant nothing compared to success measured in love and sacrifice. Sarah wept, and this time she didn't try to hide it. She asked why he would do all this for strangers, what she'd done to deserve this kind of grace, and Daniel told her the truth. He said he was doing it because he needed to remember how to be human again, because his life had become all balance sheets and market shares while his own son slipped away from him. He said Chris had given him a gift in that bakery, a moment of clarity that cut through years of self-deception, and helping them was the only way he could think to honor that gift. He said he was tired of being successful and miserable, tired of winning at life while losing at living, and maybe by helping them he could find his way back to the man he'd meant to be before ambition had poisoned everything. The months that followed reshaped Daniel in ways he never anticipated. He kept his promise to Sarah, helping her find stable housing, connecting her with medical care, ensuring Chris never went hungry again. But more than that, he brought Marcus to visit them, and he watched his son learn lessons about resilience and gratitude that no amount of money could have taught. He saw Marcus and Chris become friends, saw his son's eyes open to a world beyond privilege, saw him learn to value people for their character rather than their possessions. And in teaching his son these lessons, Daniel finally learned them himself. He restructured his life, delegating responsibilities at work, setting boundaries he'd never believed in before. He moved closer to Marcus, negotiating new custody arrangements with his ex-wife, showing up for soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and the thousand small moments that build a childhood. He started a foundation through his company, focused on helping single parents avoid the abyss that had almost swallowed Sarah and Chris. He hired Sarah once she was healthy enough to work, bringing her into the foundation to help design programs that actually understood what families in crisis needed. Years later, when Chris graduated high school as valedictorian with a full scholarship to college, Daniel sat in the audience next to Marcus and Sarah and Mrs. Chen, and he wept openly as this remarkable young man spoke about the power of small moments to change everything. Chris told the story of the day he'd walked into a bakery to ask for expired bread and walked out with a family he'd never expected. He talked about how one person's choice to see him, to really see him, had altered the trajectory of his entire life. He thanked his mother for teaching him that dignity and poverty weren't opposites, that you could have nothing and still carry yourself with grace. And he thanked Daniel for showing him that success could be measured in human connections rather than bank accounts, that the richest people weren't those with the most money but those with the most love. Daniel understood then what he'd been too blind to see in those years of building his empire. That the moment in the bakery hadn't been about him saving Chris and Sarah. It had been about them saving him. That child asking for expired bread had been offering Daniel something infinitely more valuable than any business deal. A chance to remember his own humanity, to reconnect with his son, to understand that the only legacy that mattered was the one measured in changed lives and open hearts. The truth is that we're all walking past moments like this every day, opportunities to see people who've been rendered invisible by our hurry and our self-importance. We're all capable of being Daniel before the bakery, so focused on building success that we forget to build lives worth living. But we're also all capable of being transformed by a child's simple request, by a moment of vulnerability that cracks open our carefully constructed defenses and lets the light back in. So if you've been racing through life, convinced that the next promotion or the next milestone will finally make you happy, remember Daniel in that bakery. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop, kneel down, and really see the person in front of you. Remember that expired bread can be the most nourishing thing in the world when it comes with compassion, and that the questions we're most afraid to hear are often the ones we most need to answer. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to slow down and see the people around you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because stories like this, stories about redemption and connection and the surprising places grace appears, are the ones that remind us why we're here. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never too successful to learn from a child asking for bread, and you are never too poor to offer someone else the gift of your humanity.